See, when you talk about personality in cars, there are lots of different ways to go about it. Some of them can be in terms of the way the car interacts with you. Others could be in the way the car drives. And then there are certain car makers that are odd for the sake of being odd, which I prefer to call being obtuse. And over the last week that I've driven this, the Aura 07 Long Range, I have a feeling that it falls into the latter camp. Now, if you'll spend the next 20 odd minutes with me, I'll explain why. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the Aura 07 Long Range. Now, before we get into all the weirdness, let's get on to sort of the basic stuff. So the Aura 07 Long Range is an all-electric vehicle, which means power comes from an 83.5 kilowatt-hour battery, which is either NMC or LFP, I can't seem to figure it out, with a rated range of 640 kilometers on the NEDC cycle. Now, in Malaysia, running more realistically, you should be able to expect about 550 to 580 on a full charge. Now, in terms of power, you get a front-mounted motor producing 201 horsepower and 340 Newton meters of torque. And in terms of charging, you get 11 kilowatt AC charging, which can juice this thing up from dead to full in about 8-ish hours. Whereas via a fast charger, a CCS2 charger, this can DC charge up to 88 kilowatts, which means that according to Aura, this car can go from 30 to 80% in about half an hour. Now, I mentioned the charging speeds because it is a point worth bringing up with the Aura 07, because this car competes directly with the BYD Seal and the Tesla Model 3, both of which will do, well, about double for fast charging, or in fact more than double if you get the Tesla Model 3. But in terms of AC charging, it isn't really that bad because the Seal, for example, only does 7.4, so it does claw back some points. But then again, if you're watching this review, chances are you do not give a rat's ass about all the technical bits because you're watching this because you think the car looks interesting. And interesting is the word I'd use because I still can't quite figure out where I sit on this. Now, the designer at Aura is an alumnus of Porsche and VAG, which is why you see a lot of VAG style sort of inspirations around this car. So you've got these oval headlights up front, which are very reminiscent of what you get with a Porsche, and inside there's even like this sort of crystalline effect, which is very reminiscent of what you get with a Bentley, which is a very strange thing to put together. Now, you also get this very low front end, which is what you'd see a lot in electric saloons because it does help with the aerodynamics. I will admit that I do quite like the lower front end treatment where you have this sort of nice geometric-y pattern, as well as a little bit of air ducting down below, which does actually help to cool the brakes as well as cool the battery underneath. Now, because this is a front-engined or front-motored electric vehicle, underneath this bonnet you will find nothing. There is no space. There is only some self-serviceable items like your washer fluid and stuff like that, but aside from that, down here there is nothing for you to fiddle with. You will struggle to find an angle on this car that doesn't look distinctive because I will give the Aura 07 that. Nothing looks like this, and you may soon realize why that is. Now, before I get into that, let's just delve into the details. So you have this sort of single bow roofline which comes all the way out to this very rounded rear end, which does make it look a little bit like a Porsche Panamera if you've never actually seen a Porsche Panamera. Now, rolling stock is handled by a set of 18-inch alloy wheels on this long range. Performance models get 19 inches, and they're wrapped in Hankook Ventus S1 Evo 3 tires, which is a decently high-performance tire given the fact this is a heavy vehicle, but also something that has to handle a lot of electric torque. Now, further details on the side include these flush door handles, which pop out when you lock and unlock the car. But what I think is perhaps one of the most distinctive details on the 07 is the spoiler, which has now decided not to deploy, and so we'll just insert some footage here. Now, the thing about the spoiler is that there isn't quite a set way it goes up and down. It's not like a Porsche in the sense that when you hit a certain speed, it goes up and then it retracts when you slow down. It just sort of does its own thing. Now, you can switch the spoiler off or just leave it retracted most of the time within a menu in the screen, which is how I prefer it, because I have a sneaking suspicion, in addition to providing a negligible amount of additional downforce, I actually think that it may increase drag. But Aura won't respond to me on this, so I suppose we'll just have to theorize. And that same story of distinction sort of extends to the rear, where again, it doesn't look like anything else out there. Now, from this angle, you may have spotted the fact this car has a full glass roof, and that's because it's basically sort of like a two-piece sort of affair where the rear windscreen actually starts about here. Now, this pays some dividend inside, but I'm getting ahead of myself. At the back, you have these very distinctive tail lights, which also incorporate the brake lights and so on, and has broadly the same design effect as we said in the front. Obviously, there are no exhaust pipes because this is an electric car, and you do have a lot of badging. This is an Aura 07 by GWM. It's all there. Now, in case you're wondering, there is actually no way to tell if this is the performance model or not, because there is no additional badging or any sort of exterior distinction to tell you that. The other strange thing is, despite this hatchbacky style tail, it's not actually a hatchback, because if I press this button, it will reveal, eventually, a boot. Now, the space inside is actually a little bit smaller than what you get from the Seal as well as the Tesla Model 3. In fact, it's significantly smaller than what you get from the Model 3. It is about long enough to fit golf bags if you're not very tall. Otherwise, if you are of average height like me, then you are going to struggle somewhat. There isn't even that much space underneath the boot floor, for example, to hide the charging cables, because it's all filled up with styrofoam as well as your tire repair kit. And on top of that, this space will then be taken up by the aforementioned charging cables, which come with the car, as well as this bag. Now, this bag represents everything I hate about current electric car design. We've seen this with the Smart Hashtag 3, we've seen this with the Tesla Model 3, the BYD Seal, and now the Aura 07. This is the bag for the manual sunshades, which you have to install as a two-piece yourself over the front and the rear. If BMW can fit a front rolling electric sunblind, then you can damn well do the same thing for 170 grand. Now, the inside of the 07 has the same sort of design flair as the exterior, where again we see a lot of inspiration from VAG products. So for example, this waterfall center console with these 3 rings and some physical buttons for some of the basic controls, this is very reminiscent of what we've seen from, of all brands, Bugatti. And then you've got the air conditioning vents, which you can only control via the infotainment screen. That is definitely a Porsche Panamera thing, if I've ever seen one. And the same goes for these sort of 3 cowls over the instrument binnacles. Now, of course, Porsche has 5, and although this is digital regardless, the fact that you have these sort of 3 cowls does at least make it very distinctive, and it also makes the screen a lot more legible during the day, because it does do a very good job at reducing the amount of glare. Now, talking about that screen leads me onto the screens. So here you've got your central infotainment display, which obviously is smaller than what you get from Tesla and BYD, but I would argue that this is a slightly better execution of a center infotainment screen, because at least it displays all the information that you need in a manner that is easy for your eyes to focus on. So for example, if you have Android Auto or Apple CarPlay here with your directions, at least moving your line of focus from here to here and then back to where you're driving is a lot faster than it would be if you had a massive central screen that is usually positioned about here. Now, on top of that, because it's landscape oriented, it also means that it's a little bit easier for you to divide the screen up to do various things. So normally I have my nav on this side and my audio on that side, and it just makes life a little bit easier. Now, the great thing about this screen and the way sort of the user interface works is that it does communicate very well with the driver's display. Because if I have directions here, it actually pops up on my leftmost binnacle here. And it also pops up on the heads-up display when I need it. And the fact that this works so seamlessly with Android Auto means that I don't really need to refer to this at all if there's a junction coming up or so on. I'll be able to see it straight in my line of sight. The HUD also does a pretty good job at telling me of sort of warnings and stuff like that if I'm straying out of my lane or if there's something in my blind spot, which is also mirrored in the center binnacle here in that infotainment display, because it not only shows me the lane and what's ever going on in my blind spot, but it is also smart enough to tell me if the road is about to curve. Now, I know that sounds really obtuse, but hear me out. On displays like these and a lot of other cars, it will wait for a steering input before it shows that the road is curving. Whereas in the Aura, it actually shows that the road is curving before you turn the wheel. This tells me that the car is actually intelligent enough to figure out what's going on and then display it accurately to the driver. That should at least tell me that maybe the ADAS systems on this car are a little bit better, which they're not, because I'll tell you about that a little bit later. Now, that aside, the controls in this car are relatively simple. So while the majority of the HVAC control functions are within the screen, at least you can adjust your temperature and your fan speed through here. You also have an automatic button and a button to switch the air conditioning on and off. However, if you want to do anything more than that, like say adjust the air conditioning vents, that's in here. You want to adjust the air quality control, that's in here. If you want to adjust the climate zone on the passenger side, then that also goes through here, because otherwise everything is just sort of controlled through this thing, which is just a bit annoying. Now, this car also comes with ventilated seats, which you also have to control in there. Basically, you control everything in there. But at least I can control things like my rear windscreen heater, my AC controls, etc. all through here. And of course, this lowest most button here is for the drive modes. Now, there are several drive modes for you to cycle from. There is obviously Eco. It chimes like that. There's a well-being function, which apparently also switches on the wipers. There's a normal mode, a sport mode, and an individual mode where you have a max speed of 150 kilometers an hour, whereas this car's full VMAX is about 170. Now, I'm not entirely sure what well-being mode means, and I'm not entirely sure how individual mode is, because I can't seem to find a way to personalize it, but there we are. Now, beyond that, practicality in this car is a bit of a mixed bag, because while you have a decently sized center armrest here, as well as a decently sized glove box here, as well as a decently sized set of door bins big enough to fit a liter-sized bottle, there is unfortunately only one cup holder. Now, it's very swish how it pushes down to hold the cup, and then you can push it back up again so it's nice and, you know, flat. But I just think that it would have been nicer to have had two cup holders. That aside, there is at least a little space here for the wireless charger, where you can put your phone and it stands upright, and there's a little roller that keeps the phone in contact with the wireless charging pad, so there isn't any of the issues of the phone sliding about. So that's certainly a good thing. Now, before I leave the front end of the cabin, there are a couple of things I'd like to touch on. This steering wheel, for example, has a lot of physical controls. Unfortunately, the cruise control and adaptive cruise control are manipulated via the gear selector stalk on the right, very Tesla style. However, it does have some irritations, which I'll get onto a little bit later. But what I find even more irritating are actually the buttons that sit on this side of the steering wheel, which control the lights, because you only have automatic for the headlights or not automatic. That's it. It's either auto on or off. Now, I find this annoying because I do actually quite like to sit in the car if I'm waiting with the positioning lights on at night, so that people know that I'm in the car. But in order to do that, I have to go in the screen. That's really annoying. The other thing is that the boot release button also lives here, but you can't open the boot unless you first unlock the car, which is also perhaps quite a sensible thing to do, but it's not something that I've seen on any other vehicle, and so I found myself having to unlock the car entirely before opening the boot. Just a bit strange. Now, that aside, there's also an infinity audio system in this car, which is punchy, but not great. Now, as you can see in the back of the Aura 07, despite that enormous glass roof, it isn't actually all that bright in here. And that's because, as standard, the majority of this glass roof is very heavily tinted. As a result, it does mean that the amount of light you get in here is kind of limited, but at least you get some sort of view out. Now, sitting back here does reveal one of the 07's party pieces, and that is in terms of space, because with this seat set up in my driving position of about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room and plenty of space to stretch out. So much so that if stretched out like this, I do enjoy quite a good amount of under thigh support. The only trouble is that very exuberant roofline also means that there is some compromise in terms of rear head space, where I've only got about that much room, and again, I'm not exactly the tallest person out there, which means that if you are taller than 170, you might struggle somewhat to sit back here. On top of that, this rear recline angle is a little bit more upright than I would have liked, and there is no way to adjust it, which means that this is basically all you've got. Now that said, I will say that in terms of interior quality, just like the front, the back is also slathered in a lot of soft touch materials, and they extend a lot further down than you might expect. It's only sort of down here that you sort of discover some slightly harder wearing and therefore harder touch plastics. You get a couple of crotch coolers down here, and I will say that because they are very, very low. There's USB-C and USB-A port. There's a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders. I've got a couple of pockets behind the seats, and the door cards are large enough to fit, again, a litre-sized bottle in the door pockets themselves. And there are a couple of things I'd like to point out. Firstly, if you have rear-facing child seats, you're going to struggle because these two-piece front seats stretch a little bit further back, although the door openings are decent-ish to fit a rear-facing child seat. On top of that, these ISOFIX mount covers are affixed in place, which means you're not about to lose them. And on top of that, there is also the matter of the carpets. Now, when we reviewed the Aura 07 Performance in Sepang, I noted that this car has sort of deep pile carpets, very reminiscent of what you get, for example, in a Rolls-Royce. However, what Rolls-Royce does, naturally, is ensure the carpets stay in place, most likely because they're heavy, because these not lambswool carpets have a certain thing about them about getting loose. Now, in the driver's footwell, they do stay in place, so I'll say that much. However, in the passenger seat and in the rear, it's very easy for these carpets to become dislodged. And when that happens, it does make it look a little bit unattractive in here, if that's of any consequence. Now, the thing about the Aura 07 is that in addition to all of this sort of nice soft touch materials and this and that, the other, it does compete with vehicles like, again, the Tesla Model 3 and the BYD Seal, the latter of which we remarked upon its build quality and incredible levels of NVH. And given the fact that the Aura 07 is apparently geared towards the sort of users who would prefer comfort over everything else, this should at least be as good as, if not better. Right? Well, no. See, this car doesn't quite fit that criteria for a number of reasons, but I'll start with the basics. So as I mentioned earlier, this car's got a little bit over 200 horsepower, a little bit over 300 Newton meters of torque, and because it's an electric vehicle, while those numbers don't sound particularly promising, you do still at least get instantaneous response, which is kind of what you want from a vehicle like this. You want to be able to get up to speed and then just stay there in perpetuity, which it does do pretty well. The only trouble is that once you are at speed, it starts to get a little bit hairy. But I'll touch on that in a second. So when you're driving this car around town, you will appreciate the fact that all the controls in this car are quite light, which means that it's very easy for you to manipulate the controls to sort of maneuver around tight spaces and stuff like that. The 360-degree camera in this car is especially good, which means that, again, if you find yourself in a tight spot, it should be quite easy for you to negotiate your way out of it, again, with the help of those cameras. But when the speeds start to creep up, that's when things start to fall apart. So for starters, the NVH in this car is not nearly as good as I would have expected. Not just because the BYD Seal has set an impossibly high standard, but because this is supposed to be a car that is geared towards comfort. And so comfort, and naturally a reduction in noise and an improvement in refinement, is exactly what I expect, which this car doesn't quite provide. I say that because at speeds north of about 80 kilometers an hour, there is this constant din from the tires. Now, those Hankook tires are not known for being particularly noisy, which leads me to believe that that is an issue with the car. On top of that, there is also the wind noise. So you'd think that with this nice, slippery, jelly bean-like shape, it would be a bit quieter when it comes to cutting through the air. For the most part, it is. I think the windscreen does a very good job at cutting out a lot of wind noise, but the windows don't do a particularly good job. This might be down to the fact that this car has frameless windows, which I think do look quite nice. But again, that compromise in terms of refinement means that Again, I'd rather be in a BYD Seal. But while the seats are comfortable and you've got your ventilation and massage functions and whatever, which makes things all very pleasant, there then comes the matter of comfort by way of ADAS. So the Aura 07 comes as standard with your usual level 2 semi-autonomy nonsense. So you've got your adaptive cruise control and traffic jam assist and la-di-da, all the things that you'd expect from a modern vehicle, let alone a modern Chinese electric car. The problem is in terms of execution. So in Malaysia, I believe that the majority of people who use adaptive cruise control like to keep the distance at its minimum setting, the closest possible distance to the vehicle in front, because that is most representative of how we drive. However, in this car, even with the minimum setting, you will find that it keeps an unusually big distance between you and the vehicle in front. And this starts at about 40 kilometers an hour. Beneath that is a bit more reasonable, but above that it just gets really far away. And it's not like it does that in order to be smooth, because if a vehicle were to suddenly cut into that enormous gap, the Aura will then react rather insistently by braking in order to, again, aggressively maintain that gap, which doesn't make the experience in the car particularly pleasant. On top of that, the intelligent cruise control in this car, the one that actually controls the lane centering and stuff like that, also isn't quite calibrated for our market, which means it prefers to sit towards the left side of the lane rather than the right, which again creates a scenario where you will not feel all that confident engaging the system at all. Now, you may be saying, yes, this is all well and good, but maybe the Aura 07 is better when you find some back roads. It's not. Now, it's not just the small wheels that have something to do with this, because obviously when you're dealing with this kind of weight moving around, it does sort of push itself here and there. But it's made worse by the fact that dynamically, this car isn't really here or there. The steering wheel is numb completely, which means you get absolutely zero feedback, but it's also not all that accurate. And if you think that it's because I have the steering wheel in its lightest most setting, I'll have you know that when you put it in normal or sport, or its heaviest settings, then it just feels artificially weighted. So at no point does the steering wheel feel like it's all that accurate. And when you put all of that together, it sort of creates a situation where I'm struggling to find any one area where the Aura 07 stands out. Worse still is the fact that beyond the design, this car doesn't really seem to have much character to it. It's not that fun to drive, although I didn't really expect it to be anyway. It's not that quiet or refined, as I'm sure you can hear now on Subang Airport Road just how loud this is. Bear in mind I'm only doing 80. And it's just, I'm trying to figure out where exactly this car does one thing particularly better than anyone else. I will admit that yes, this car does turn heads. It is very distinctively designed. But there has to be more to a car than just design. On top of that, the fact that the ADAS systems in this car render things like traffic jam assist and adaptive cruise control essentially practically unusable means that I'm just left driving this car around, which means that the experience is not that dissimilar to what I had in a Renault Zoe, which is significantly more affordable than this. Oh, hang on a second, no, the Zoe is about the same price. Anyway, the point is, I think that as far as electric vehicles go, especially ones from China, we've gotten very used to them punching above their weight. Because if you were to turn back the clock, say 5-10 years ago, this experience that I have in this is broadly what you would have expected from a vehicle that is pushing 170,000 ringgit. It's just that vehicles like this BYD Seal, as well as the Tesla Model 3, etc., have all sort of pushed the bar a little bit further, and so we expect more for our money. And so it is just a shame, because I would have liked the Aura 07 to have had a little bit more character, or at least a singular USP that I think would push buyers across the line. Because while design is important, I don't think that is the primary reason you buy a car, especially one, again, at 170,000 ringgit. Perhaps if you were buying, say, a Porsche sports car or a Mini, then maybe, yes, the design flair, etc., makes up a lot of that product's selling points. But in this, not so much. And it's really a shame, because again, I would have liked to have had something to say about it. Now, if you prefer a slightly more dynamic driving experience, I might point you in the direction of the Tesla Model 3, particularly if you enjoy infuriating ways to manage your car, like trying to figure out how to change the gears or how to use the indicators all over again. If you'd like a slightly more refined and more traditional experience, you may prefer things like the BYD Seal, which in rear-wheel drive guise, which is about 10,000 ringgit more than this, offers similar range with improved charging as well as an LFP battery, which allows you to charge the car to full every single time. But if you ask me, as of right now, I am really struggling to find an area where I would recommend the Aura 07. If you want to stand out, if you really want to be very different from the crowd, then yes, this car might appeal to you. But I would then try to appeal to your slightly more sensible side, because that should not be the primary reason you buy a car. There are many compromises that have to be made in order for that to work, and I don't think those are compromises that should be made at all. But in any case, that is our review of the Aura 07 long range. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.